The wind carried a thick film of dust down the narrow main street of Dry Creek, a forgotten town with more boarded-up windows than open doors. The sun was high, scorching the earth and everything on it. The few townsfolk who still called this place home had either taken refuge indoors or slouched under the wooden awnings that provided a sliver of shade. Luke McAllister, a lone cowboy with silver threading through his dark beard, pulled his bay horse to a halt outside the general store. His coat was worn, his boots coated in trail dust, and his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He dismounted slowly, the saddle creaking, his long ride leaving a dull ache in his legs. The town didn't feel like much, but it had what he needed: coffee, bullets, and maybe a hot meal if he was lucky. He hadn't taken more than 2 steps before he heard the voice. "Please, sir, just 1 coin." He paused. The voice was small, unsure, a whisper. "Really?" Like someone was afraid of being told no again. Turning, Luke saw a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting on the stoop beside the general store. Her dress was torn, patched in places with mismatched cloth. Her hair was tangled and sun-bleached, framing a face that looked far too old for her years. Most striking of all were her bare feet, calloused and dusty, curled inward like they were trying to shrink away from the world. She held a tin of polish in one hand, a rag in the other. "I can shine your boots," she said again, holding the rag out with a trembling hand. "Just 1 coin." Luke stared at her for a long moment. He'd seen hard times, hell. He'd lived through worse than most, but this girl looked like she hadn't eaten in days. He took a slow breath, then shook his head. "Don't need a shine," he said gruffly. Her hand dropped. She nodded without complaint, folding into herself. She didn't beg again, didn't chase after him like some street urchins might. That quiet dignity hit Luke harder than any plea ever could. Inside the general store, he picked up supplies: beans, jerky, a tin of tobacco, but his mind wasn't on what he was buying. He kept thinking about the girl's face, the quiet hope in her voice, the way her stomach looked too flat under that dirty dress, and her bare feet like she hadn't owned shoes in years. "Who's the girl?" Luke finally asked the storekeeper, as he paid. "Clara, lives out near the edge of town," the old man muttered without looking up. "Her pa ain't been seen since last week. She's been scrounging around town the last few days. Folks try not to get involved. No one wants more mobs to feed." Luke frowned. "Where's her ma?" "Dead. Fever took her last winter." He walked outside, saddlebag slung over his shoulder, and found her still sitting on the stoop. Same spot, same posture, rag in hand, just waiting. He stopped in front of her, looked down. "You still want that coin?" She blinked up at him, eyes wide. She nodded slowly. He reached into his vest pocket and fished out a silver coin. Not much, but enough for a meal or 2. He handed it to her without a word. She took it with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke turned to walk away, but her next words stopped him cold. "It's not for food. I need it to bury my pa." He turned back slowly. "What did you say?" She looked up at him, eyes wide and watery, but without tears. "He died 2 days ago. I couldn't carry him far, so I just wrapped him up. I need enough coins to pay the preacher to bury him." Silence hung between them, broken only by the creak of a swinging saloon door down the street. Luke stared at her, his throat tight, something bitter rising from his gut. He had seen war, had watched men die screaming, had buried friends with his own hands, but nothing had ever made him feel so hollow as watching this little girl speak of death like it was an everyday thing. She lowered her eyes, like she was ashamed of even saying it. Luke crouched slowly until he was eye level with her. "Where is he?" "Out in the shack, just past the last windmill." He stood, looked toward the edge of town, then back at her. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." She hesitated, confused. "Why?" "'Cause no child should have to bury their father alone." Luke McAllister walked with long, measured strides, letting the little girl set the pace. Clara's steps were slow and timid, her bare feet careful on the cracked earth that bordered the town. She said nothing more as they left the wooden buildings behind and headed toward the wide, dry plain where the windmill creaked steadily in the distance. The late afternoon sun burned overhead, but Clara didn't seem to notice. She walked with a quiet focus, her arms wrapped around herself. Luke had seen tough men break under far less grief than what this little girl carried on her bony shoulders, and yet she didn't cry. Not once. Luke kept glancing at her, thinking of his younger sister buried young in Texas clay. That memory haunted him more now, watching Clara move like she didn't belong to the world anymore. "You got anyone?" Luke asked gently. "Kin?" Neighbors, someone close. She shook her head. It was just me and Pa. He got real sick after the last winter storm. Couldn't hardly walk. He'd still go out hunting when he could. But sometimes, he came home with nothing. Last week he didn't come home at all. Luke felt a sharp tug in his chest. Where'd you find him? I followed the buzzards, she said simply. Her voice like gravel scraping over emotion she refused to show. He made it partway down the gulch before he collapsed. I dragged him back with a wagon, but I couldn't get him in the ground. They reached the shack soon after, a tiny, one-room dwelling patched with tin and old lumber, barely standing against the wind. The door creaked as Clara opened it and stepped inside. Luke hesitated before following. He'd seen plenty of death, but something about crossing that threshold felt sacred. He removed his hat, held it to his chest, and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and candle wax. In the far corner of the shack, under a worn quilt, lay the still form of Clara's father. His boots stuck out from beneath the blanket, worn leather cracked and curled. A Bible sat nearby on a crate, open to Psalms. I tried to read it to him, Clara whispered, her back to Luke, before he passed. He liked the one about the Valley of Shadows. Luke stood silently, unsure of what to say. I washed him best I could, she continued. I thought maybe if I cleaned him up, the preacher wouldn't say no. Luke swallowed hard. Clara, you've done more than most grown folks would. You don't need to do this alone anymore. She turned to him, eyes wide. But I don't. Got the rest of the money. I only have what you gave me. He knelt in front of her. I ain't worried about coins. You'll get your father buried proper. I'll see to it. Her lips trembled, and for the first time, a tear broke through. She wiped it away angrily, like crying was a weakness she couldn't afford. Luke reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pouch. Inside were a few silver dollars and some copper bits, his travel money. It wouldn't stretch far, but he'd lived lean before. He pressed the pouch into her hand. I'll talk to the preacher, he said. We'll bury him tomorrow, at first light. Clara looked down at the coins in her hand, then back at Luke. Her voice cracked. Why are you helping me? Luke hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was some buried part of him trying to claw its way back to decency. But mostly, it was the quiet courage she carried. You remind me of someone I lost, he said softly. And I ain't gonna let the world break another girl like that. That night, Luke sat beside Clara on the front porch of the shack. They didn't say much. He gave her a slice of jerky and a chunk of bread from his saddlebag. She offered him half a bruised apple in return. They sat under the stars, the creak of the windmill turning slowly in the background. I don't remember my mom much, Clara said suddenly. She used to sing when she cooked. I remember her voice better than her face. Luke nodded, eyes fixed on the stars. My sister used to sing, too. Sweet voice, like morning birds. Silence fell between them again, but it was softer now, not so hollow. A shared stillness. As the fire they'd built crackled low. Clara leaned against Luke's arm, eyes finally closing. He wrapped his coat around her small shoulders. She slept soundly for the first time in days, and Luke, for the first time in years, felt like maybe he was meant to save someone again. At dawn, the sky over Dry Creek glowed faint orange, casting a pale hush over the broken land. The sun had not yet crested the hills, but Luke McAllister was already awake, standing in the cold morning air beside the shack. He had barely slept, kept awake by the weight of the task ahead and the child still asleep inside. The shack groaned in the wind behind him. He could hear Clara breathing evenly, curled up in the cot where he'd laid her the night before, wrapped in his coat and a thin quilt that smelled faintly of wood smoke and sorrow. Luke glanced toward the crude wagon by the shack, its wheels half buried in dust. His eyes drifted to the makeshift cross Clara had tried to build out of two pieces of splintered pine. It leaned at an odd angle, fragile as a sigh. He knew that whatever was done today had to be done right. The girl deserved that. Her father did too. Whatever sins he might have carried. Luke set to work. He found an old axe behind the shack, the handle split but usable. Then he scouted the scrubland until he found a stand of narrow pines just sturdy enough. He felled 2 of them, dragging the trunks back by hand. It was slow work, and he moved with the quiet purpose of a man who owed the dead something he could never say aloud. Hours passed, sweat mixed with sawdust. He stripped the bark, measured rough boards with his knife, and nailed them together using what was left of the supply Clara's father had kept stashed under the floorboards. By the time the sun rose high and hot, Luke had crafted a crude but solid box. A coffin, rough-hewn, splintered at the seams, but worthy of a man's final rest. He stepped inside the shack and paused, removing his hat again. Clara was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her father's body. She had braided her hair, or tried to, and wore a faded, green ribbon that must have once belonged to her mother. She looked up at Luke with eyes too calm for a child. "You built it," he nodded. "Ain't pretty, but it'll hold." Clara nodded slowly and rose to her feet. She walked to her father's body and touched his chest gently through the quilt. "Thank you, Pa," she whispered. "I'll be all right now." Luke watched without a word as she tucked a folded scrap of paper into the blanket. A drawing. Then she stepped aside. Luke approached and, with great care, lifted the body. It was light to light. The man had wasted away long before death took him. Luke laid him inside the coffin and placed the lid on top. Clara helped him nail it down. Her hands didn't shake out when they finished. Luke tied the coffin down in the wagon. He hitched up his horse and turned to Clara. "Ride with me." She hesitated. "Can I sit in the back with him?" Luke nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. She climbed up into the wagon bed and settled beside the coffin, one hand resting lightly on the wood dot as they rode into town. Heads began to turn. Dry Creek had a habit of ignoring the poor, the sick, the orphan, but no one could ignore a child riding into town behind her father's coffin, guarded by a silent cowboy with eyes like gunmetal. They stopped outside the little whitewashed church on the edge of town. Preacher Wallace, a thin, aging man with watery eyes, stepped out onto the porch. Luke climbed down and met him halfway. "We need a burial now." The preacher looked past Luke to the wagon. "I heard the girl's been trying for days to scrape up the fee. She has it now," Luke said, handing him a small pouch. "And more." The preacher held the pouch, unsure what to say. Then he nodded solemnly and opened the gates. The churchyard was dry and cracked, but the graves were neat, the crosses all white and still. Clara followed Luke and the preacher as they carried the coffin to the far edge of the yard, beside a cottonwood that cast a little bit of shade. She held Luke's hand tightly while the preacher said a prayer. She didn't cry, not once, but when the final amen fell quiet on the breeze, she knelt beside the grave and pressed her palm to the fresh earth. She whispered something Luke couldn't hear, and didn't try to. Later, as they walked away from the mound of dirt, Clara said, "He drew you, you know. My pa said he met you once, that you spared him, long ago." Luke stiffened. "Did he say why?" She shook her head. "Only that you looked lost, just like him." Luke nodded slowly, feeling the past catch up with him like thunder on the horizon. "He wanted me to find you," Clara added. "Said if I ever had nowhere else to go, I should look for the man with the scar above his eye." Luke touched the scar absent-mindedly. "I think he knew you'd come back." The wind had changed by the time they left the churchyard. It carried the scent of sage and a hint of oncoming rain. The kind of wind that whispered change. Luke McAllister felt it in his bones, same as he felt Clara's hand gripping his sleeve tighter than before. The coffin was buried, the prayer was spoken, and yet the weight hadn't lifted from her shoulders. It had just settled into a different shape. They walked back to the wagon slowly. Clara's ribbon had come undone, and her braid unraveled in the wind. She didn't fix it. She just stared ahead, jaw tight, eyes dry. Luke had seen that look before on soldiers after battle, on mothers who buried too many children. But she was only a child. He helped her climb into the wagon and didn't say a word until they were halfway out of town. "You got anywhere to go now?" She hesitated. I can stay in the shack. I've lived there since Ma died. It's not much." "But no," Luke said gently. "That place ain't fit for you, and you shouldn't be out there alone. Not with that banker sniffing around." Clara turned her head sharply. "Mr. Hanley came by a few days ago. Said we owed taxes. Pa told me not to let him inside." Luke's jaw clenched. Hanley owned half the town's land. What wasn't dried up or broken, he collected like a snake. Coils around prey. "That man's not interested in debts," Luke muttered. "He's interested in taking what ain't his." "But the land's ours," Clara said, confused. "Pa bought it years ago. I remember him saying it was paid in full." Luke didn't answer. He was already planning his next visit to the records office. But for now, one thing mattered. "You're comin' with me," he said at last. "Just until we figure things out. I've got a ranch 3 days from here, and it's got room, fresh water, real food, a roof that don't leak." Clara didn't speak for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet he barely heard it, she asked, "Why would you do that for me?" He glanced at her. "Because I gave your pa my word once, years ago." when I spared his life out in those hills. He was a broken man, but he told me he had something worth living for. Turns out it was you." Clara blinked. "He said someone let him go, but he never told me who. Said it was a man with a scar over his eye. Said that scar was a reminder of mercy." Luke looked ahead, past the dusty trail winding out of town. "Yeah, well, I was a different man then. Meaner, angrier. He was bleeding bad, and I could've finished it. But he looked me in the eye and said he had a little girl waiting back home. I guess I wanted to believe that meant something. It did." Clara said softly, "You saved him. He came back to me." Luke nodded. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was honest. By the time they reached town again, Clara was half dozing beside him. Luke reined in his horse outside the town's boarding house. The building was 2 stories of crooked windows and dusty lace curtains. A woman stood on the porch, arms folded. Mrs. Price, the widow who ran the place, with a spine of iron and a tongue like a whip. Luke carried Clara up the steps while she blinked sleep from her eyes. "I need a room for the girl," he said. Mrs. Price looked him over. "You bringin' in orphans now, McAllister?" "She's not an orphan," he said. "Not while I'm around. She ain't clean. She's got no shoes, no proper dress. She's got a name, Clara, and she just buried her father with more grace than most grown men I've known." Mrs. Price narrowed her eyes. "And who's payin'?" "I am," Luke said, pulling a coin pouch from his coat. "And if I hear anyone in town say a word against her, I'll take my cattle and my business somewhere else." The widow's eyes flicked to the silver coins, then to Clara. Her expression softened a fraction. "She can stay in the back room," Mrs. Price said at last, "but she keeps to herself." Luke gave a tight nod and helped Clara inside. The room was small but clean, with a cot, a quilt, and a small wash basin. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, eyes wide, as if afraid it would disappear if she blinked. "You'll be safe here for now," Luke said, crouching in front of her. "I've got some things to tend to in town business with that banker, but I'll be back before sundown." "All right," she nodded slowly. "You'll come back, I give you my word." Clara reached out and grabbed his hand before he could stand. "Don't let them take the land, Mr. Luke. That's where my ma's buried, and now Pa." Luke felt a stone settle in his chest. He squeezed her hand gently. "No one's taken anything, not while I'm still standing." Luke McAllister walked out of the boarding house with a storm brewing in his chest. The more time he spent in Dry Creek, the more he realized the place was hollowed out by fear and silence. Folks didn't talk unless they had to, and no one helped unless it earned them something. Clara's story wasn't rare. It was just the first one he'd bothered to listen to. He headed toward the town clerk's office, intent on digging through land records. But first, he needed something Clara couldn't ask for: her self-respect, and for that, she needed dignity, clean clothes, sturdy boots, and a proper place in the world. Even if that place started small. The dry goods store opened early, and Luke spent a good chunk of coin on a cotton dress, wool stockings, a worn pair of second-hand boots, and a comb. He even bought a ribbon the same color green Clara had worn in her hair at the graveyard. He carried the bundle up Main Street and back to the boarding house. Mrs. Price met him at the door, arms folded and eyes flinty as a hawk's. "You're back." Luke nodded and stepped past her without asking. Clara's still asleep. "She's up." Was sitting at the window, staring out. "Quiet little thing." Mrs. Price sniffed. "You intend to keep spoiling her like this?" Luke turned, his gaze sharp. "Giving a child shoes and a clean dress after she buried her father ain't spoilin'. It's human decency." Mrs. Price's lips twitched, but she didn't argue. He knocked on the back room's door, and Clara answered quickly. Her hair was still messy, and her clothes hung looser today than they had the day before, like she was shrinking into herself. "These are for you," Luke said, setting the bundle on the small wooden table. Clara looked from the clothes to Luke, as if unsure she was allowed to touch them. "They're mine." He nodded. "You've earned better than rags." She approached, slowly, running her fingers along the folded fabric. "My ma used to sew. She would have loved the green ribbon." Luke gave a tight smile. "Well then, she'll be with you every time you wear it." She nodded, clutching the bundle to her chest. After she changed and combed her hair, she stepped out shyly. The dress was a little big, but the boots fit well enough. With her hair brushed and her face washed, she didn't look like a beggar anymore. She looked like a girl again. Luke's chest tightened. "I need to take care of some things in town," he told her. "You stay here. Don't answer the door unless it's me or Mrs. Price." Clara nodded solemnly. "I won't." Luke turned to Mrs. Price before he left. "You watch her. I'm not her nursemaid, McAllister. The widow said coolly. No, he replied. But I'm paying you like one. He left before she could argue, boots pounding against the boards as he crossed the street toward the records office. Inside, the clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a crooked spine, barely looked up. From his papers. Help you. I need land records for the shack on the South Ridge. Belonged to a man named Tom Weller. The clerk's eyes sharpened. That property was seized for unpaid taxes. Luke leaned on the desk. I was told he paid. The clerk hesitated, then pulled a ledger from a shelf. He thumbed through it slowly, then stopped. Here, he muttered. Last payment was made 3 months ago, on time, full amount. Luke's jaw clenched. Then why was it seized? The clerk adjusted his glasses. Well, according to these notes, it wasn't officially processed. The money was never logged as received. Luke knew a rat when he smelled one. And who logged that payment? The clerk paled slightly. Banker Hanley's office took the funds. Of course he did. Luke stepped back from the counter, fire rising in his gut. He'd seen men like Hanley before, cowards in fine suits who bled the weak dry from behind desks. But this wasn't just about money, it was about power, and now it was personal. When Luke returned to the boarding house, Clara was sitting at the table drawing in a scrap notebook with a broken pencil. She looked up and smiled shyly when she saw him. I drew your horse. Luke glanced down. The sketch was rough, but it was clearly his bay stallion down to the scar on its flank. That's real good, Clara. She lit up at the praise. Mrs. Price walked by and paused at the doorway. She's been quiet, polite. You were right, she ain't trouble. Luke nodded. She's more than that. She's brave. Mrs. Price hesitated, then added, there's stew if she's hungry. Luke raised a brow. That your way of saying she can stay longer? She can stay, Mrs. Price muttered. But only 'cause you scare me more than she does. Luke smiled faintly, but inside he felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, this town wasn't beyond saving. And neither was he. That evening, as twilight swept its soft blue over Dry Creek, the boarding house grew quiet. The saloon across the street still clanged with laughter and piano music. But here, inside the warm-lit back room, a different kind of peace settled. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, pencil in hand, hunched over her sketchbook. Luke watched her from the chair by the window. He hadn't said much since returning from the records office. His mind spun with thoughts of Hanley's fraud, the stolen land, and the weight of the promise he'd made to a dying outlaw, and now to his daughter. You draw a lot? Luke asked finally, his voice low and thoughtful. Clara nodded, not looking up. Since I was little. Ma used to say I was born with a pencil in my hand. Luke smiled slightly. Your pa let you keep drawing. He encouraged it, she said, flipping to a new page. Said when we couldn't afford paper, I could sketch in the dirt. He even made a little journal for me, stitched the pages together. I still got it. She crawled across the room and opened a small wooden box she kept under the bed. From inside, she carefully pulled out a worn, leather-bound booklet with frayed corners and smudged charcoal marks. This one has the important ones, she whispered, holding it protectively. Luke leaned forward. Can I see? She hesitated, then handed it to him with the reverence one might give a holy book. He opened the journal slowly, page by page, scanning sketches of birds, horses, stars, and mountains. Each was rough but filled with soul. But it was the last few drawings that made him pause, his fingers tightening slightly on the page. One was a man's face, square jaw, tired eyes, a long scar above the right eyebrow. He blinked. It was him. He turned the page. The next sketch showed the same man, seated by a campfire, smoke curling around him. Behind him, faint outlines of 3 other men, one bleeding, one holding a rifle, and one slumped over, dead. Luke froze. The memory hit like a punch to the gut. He remembered that fire, remembered the blood in the dirt, the heat of gunfire in the hills, the screams. It was the night he'd spared Tom Weller, Clara's father, during a skirmish between bounty hunters and a half-starved gang. He hadn't meant to let him live, not at first. But something in the man's eyes, desperation, maybe, or the whispered name of a daughter, had stayed his hand. Clara watched him silently. Luke looked up slowly. He remembered all this. She nodded. He told me the story more than once. Said a man with a scar saved him when he didn't deserve saving. Said he was ready to die. But you looked at him and saw something else. Maybe hope. Luke exhaled, running a hand down his face. He wasn't a good man, Clara. He did bad things. I know, she whispered. But he came back different. He wasn't proud of who he'd been. He tried real hard to be someone better for me. Luke looked down again at the sketch of himself. Why'd he draw me? He wanted me to find you. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should look for the man who gave him a second chance. He believed you'd do the same for me." Luke closed the journal and handed it back to her carefully. "I ain't sure I'm the man your pa thought I was. I am," she said quietly. "You gave him mercy. Then you gave me food, a bed, boots, and a promise. That's who you are." Those words settled like an anchor in Luke's chest. It had been years since anyone saw something in him worth believing in. Maybe never. A knock on the door broke the silence. Mrs. Price stepped in with 2 bowls of stew, steam curling up from chipped porcelain. "Thought you two could use supper." Clara smiled shyly and whispered a thank you. The widow paused at the door and looked at Luke. "That girl," she said, "she's got more fire than most men in this town. Whatever you're doing for her, keep doing it. You might just save her life." Luke nodded, accepting the bowl. As they ate in silence, Clara reached into her sketchbook and started another drawing, this one of the church graveyard, with 2 small crosses beneath a tree and a cowboy's hat resting on the fence post. Luke didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He knew now he wasn't just helping Clara. He was being redeemed by her. The next morning brought a cold wind through Dry Creek, as if the town itself braced for something coming. Luke McAllister stood in front of the town hall building, staring at the warped wooden sign that read property and tax records in faded paint. The notebook Clara had shown him still weighed heavy in his coat pocket, not because of its weight but because of what it meant, a reminder of a man he once spared, and the daughter he was now bound to protect. He stepped inside. The clerk was there again, hunched behind the desk, trying not to meet Luke's eyes. "I want to see the ledger from the day Tom Weller paid those taxes," Luke said flatly. "I already showed you the notes," the clerk stammered. Luke set his hands down on the desk slowly. "I don't want the notes. I want the original ledger. The paper where Tom signed and handed over his money." The clerk hesitated. Then, after a few painful seconds, he turned and pulled a thick, leather-bound book from the shelf. Luke flipped through it until he found the date in question. His jaw clenched. There it was, Tom Weller's signature, scrawled in the margin, right under the column marked "Paid in Full." Beside it, in different ink, "Funds held by B. Hanley. Processing delayed." Luke's lip curled. So Hanley took the money, didn't log the payment, and claimed the land. The clerk shifted in his chair. I don't know why he delayed it. Maybe it was a mistake." "No, it was theft," Luke said. "And now he's trying to claim the shack and everything on it, including to graves." Without waiting for another word, Luke grabbed the ledger and stormed out, heading straight for the Dry Creek Bank. Hanley's office sat behind glass doors, polished and smug-looking, out of place in a town where nothing else shined. Luke kicked the door open. Benjamin Hanley, plump and powdered in a vest too tight for his belly, looked up in alarm from behind his desk. "McAllister, what's the meaning of this? You stole from Tom Weller," Luke growled, slamming the ledger down. "You took his tax payment, didn't file it, and now you're trying to seize land that belongs to his daughter." Hanley's face went pale for a second before he leaned back and tried to recover his smirk. "You're making accusations without legal standing." "I've got his signature," Luke snapped, "and your name beside it. It's enough to ruin you." Hanley steepled his fingers. He was a known outlaw. "McAllister, you think this town will defend his property claim?" Luke stepped forward slowly. "This ain't about him anymore. It's about a child. She's got nowhere else to go, and you're standing between her and the only piece of ground her folks are buried on." Hanley's smirk wavered. "You go through with this," Luke continued, "I'll make sure every rancher between here and Abilene knows what kind of man you are. You'll lose business, respect, everything, or you can walk away and let the girl keep what's hers." The banker stared at him for a long time. Then, reluctantly, he sighed. "She can keep the land," he muttered, "but I'll need an official withdrawal filed, clean." "I'll see to it," Luke said. "But if I hear you set one more boot near her land, I'll return, and next time, I won't bring paperwork." Hanley swallowed hard. Luke left the bank, jaw tight, heart hammering, with an anger that had simmered too long. But as he stepped back onto the dusty street, a strange relief washed over him, not just from defending Clara, but from writing something he'd long left undone years ago. He'd spared Tom Weller in a canyon surrounded by corpses and broken promises he'd ridden off, thinking it didn't matter. Now, he saw the truth. Mercy ripples. What he thought was just another wounded man turned out to be a father who went home and raised a daughter with what little he had left. And now that daughter had given Luke something to redemption. By the time he returned to the boarding house, Clara was sitting by the window again, sketchbook in hand. She looked up hopefully. Well? She asked. Luke crouched beside her and nodded. It's yours, the land, the shack, your folks' graves. No one can take it now. She stared at him for a long second, then, slowly, her lip trembled, and this time, she let herself cry, silent tears streaking down her cheeks as she clutched the sketchbook to her chest. Luke reached over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You're safe now, Clara. She nodded through the tears, whispering, thank you. And Luke knew this was more than a debt repaid. This was a life he was meant to protect. The sun was barely up the next morning when the knock came. Luke had been sharpening his knife by the stove in the boarding house parlor, quietly waiting for coffee to boil. Mrs. Price had let him use her kitchen before the town stirred. He moved like a man with unfinished business because there was still one thing left unsettled. The knock came again, louder, not polite. Luke answered the door. Standing on the porch in a fine black coat was Benjamin Hanley, the banker, flanked by two well-fed deputies with badges that hadn't seen dust or gunpowder in months. Hanley's eyes were bloodshot and narrowed, and he wasn't smiling now. McAllister, he said through clenched teeth, we need to talk. Luke didn't move from the doorway. About what? The land's not yours anymore. Hanley pushed forward, but Luke stepped out and closed the door behind him. He wasn't going to let Clara see this man again, not after what she'd been through. You embarrassed me yesterday, Hanley hissed, in front of the clerk, in front of half the town. You threatened me. I told the truth, Luke replied coldly. And you backed down because you knew I had you, Hanley sneered. That land's worthless, you know, dry as bone, can't grow a damn thing on it. Then why were you so desperate to take it? Hanley looked away. Because I've got buyers coming in from back east, railroad men. They're looking to invest, and the land on the ridge is part of their survey. Luke narrowed his eyes. So you were gonna sell Clara's home, with her parents buried on it, to some rail company that doesn't give a damn about her? Hanley straightened his coat. I don't owe that girl anything. Luke took a step closer. No, but I do. Hanley's deputies shifted behind him, hands near their pistols. But Luke's stare never wavered. I'm not a lawman, Luke said evenly. I'm not even a good man, most days. But I gave that girl my word, and if you come after her again, if you so much as look toward that ridge, I'll bury you under the same tree her father lies beneath. Hanley went stiff. Is that a threat? No, Luke said, voice like gravel. It's a promise. Hanley backed down first. This ain't over, he muttered. For your sake, I hope it is. Luke replied. The banker turned, barked something at his men, and stormed off toward his office, boots slapping against the dry boards of the street. Luke watched them go, jaw tight. He knew men like Hanley never gave up after one loss. They bided their time, found back doorways to win. But Luke also knew something else. This town was watching now, and the town remembered. He spent the rest of the day quietly rallying support. First, he stopped by the preacher's house, where the old man was watering a withered garden. I'll need you to speak up, Luke said. Testify if Hanley tries anything. I already sent a letter to the circuit judge, the preacher replied, with a copy of the ledger you found. Clara's claim is clean. Next, Luke stopped by the blacksmith, who'd once lost his own land to a forged tax lien. Then the storekeeper, who admitted Hanley had docked his credit for months after a late payment. By noon, 10 men and women in town had spoken in Clara's favor, quiet voices that were now beginning to rise. Back at the boarding house, Clara sat by the window again, legs tucked under her. She had started a new drawing, a small house, built on a ridge, with smoke curling from the chimney and 2 gravestones beneath a tree. This one had her in it, smiling, and Luke too, standing beside her. He knocked on the doorframe gently. She looked up. Trouble's past for now, he said. She nodded. He came back, didn't he? The banker. Luke sat across from her. Yeah, but I sent him away, with the truth, and with a warning. She bit her lip. What if he comes again? He might, Luke admitted. But now the town's with us. They know what he's done. And more importantly, I won't let him hurt you, ever. Clara looked down at her drawing, then handed it to him. You're in this one. Luke took it carefully. He wasn't much for pictures, but he held this one like it was gold. You think we could build a house like that someday? She asked. Luke didn't answer right away. He looked out the window toward the hills. Yeah, he said finally, we could, and for the first time since this journey began. Clara smiled wide like a girl who finally believed in tomorrows. Dry Creek had always been a place where justice moved slow, if it moved at all. But that changed the day Luke McAllister stood up for a little girl with nothing but a sketchbook and a grave to protect. Word traveled fast. By sunrise the next morning, the circuit judge from Red Bluff rode into town on a cloud of dust and questions. Luke stood on the porch of the general store, hat low over his eyes, watching him dismount with a deputy close behind. The judge, Elias Pratt, a stern man in a tan coat and wire spectacles, was known for one thing: he didn't take kindly to lies. "Where's this child?" the judge asked the storekeeper. Luke stepped forward. "She's under protection at the boarding house." "You'll speak to me first." Pratt studied him. "You the one who found the irregularities in the land ledger?" "Yes," Luke said, handing over the signed document with Tom Weller's signature and the forged delay entry by Hanley's hand. "And I've got witnesses." Within the hour, a quiet revolution unfolded in Dry Creek. The preacher testified first, voice firm and sorrowful. He told the judge about the funeral, the child's desperation, and how Hanley had refused her a burial until a stranger paid. Then came the clerk, wringing his hands as he admitted under oath that Hanley had pocketed Tom Weller's tax payment, but never filed it. "He told me to keep quiet," the clerk muttered. "Said the man was an outlaw, and no one care about some shack on a ridge." Pratt's mouth thinned. Witness after witness came forward: ranchers who'd lost cattle loans to sudden foreclosure, shop owners whose accounts had been mysteriously frozen, and widows pressured to sell land they owned outright. All roads pointed to Hanley. Then, quietly, Clara arrived. She wore the green ribbon dress Luke had bought her. Her boots scuffed, but her chin lifted. She stood before the judge, sketchbook clutched in her hands like armor. "What do you wish to say, child?" Judge Pratt asked, not unkindly. Clara opened the sketchbook and showed a page to the crowded drawing of her father's grave, the cross she'd built, and the shack behind it. "This is all I had," she said, "but it was ours. My papa paid for it. I saw him hand over the coins, and then he died before they let him be buried right." Her voice cracked. "I don't want revenge," she whispered. "I just want to go home." The room was silent. Then Judge Pratt nodded slowly, as if sealing a decision in his soul. "Mr. Hanley," he said, turning to the banker, now pale and sweating in his waistcoat, "you're hereby ordered to relinquish all claims to the Weller property. Furthermore, you'll be investigated for tax fraud, extortion, and obstruction of record." Hanley stammered. "I have powerful backers, people from the Capitol." Pratt cut him off. "And now you've got a date in court. Gentlemen, remove him." The crowd parted as the judge's deputy placed iron cuffs on Hanley's wrists. The banker didn't fight, just stared at Clara, stunned that a girl he'd tried to ignore had ended his hold on Dry Creek. Luke stood with his arms crossed, eyes steady as Hanley was dragged away. Justice, long asleep in these parts, had finally awakened. Later that afternoon, Luke and Clara rode out of town in a borrowed wagon. The shack on the ridge came into view, slowly worn, tilted, but still standing. The graves beneath the cottonwood shimmered softly in the golden light. They stopped beside the porch. Clara stepped down first, her boots crunching over familiar ground. She walked to the two graves and knelt, brushing away wind-blown dust. She placed a fresh flower from town on each one, dandelions, simple and yellow. Luke followed, standing quietly beside her. "It's really ours?" she asked. Luke nodded. "Judge said it himself. You're the rightful owner now." She stood slowly and turned toward the house. "Do you think we could fix it, make it stronger?" "I reckon we could," Luke said. "Maybe add a new roof, a second room." Clara smiled. "Can I draw on the walls?" "You can paint a whole sunrise across 'em if you want." They unloaded supplies from the wagon: a hammer, nails, wood planks, flour, beans, coffee, and a kettle. A few neighbors had offered what they could. Even the preacher had sent blankets. Luke worked through sunset, repairing a window frame, while Clara swept out dust and broken glass. That night, they lit a small fire inside and shared stew from a tin pot. Clara leaned against the wall, wrapped in one of the quilts, watching the flames flicker. Luke looked over at her. "You did something most grown folks never do. You stood up and fought for what's right." Clara met his eyes. "I wasn't alone." "No," he said softly. "You weren't." As the wind rustled the cottonwood outside and the stars blinked awake, Luke realized something deep. He hadn't just saved a child's home. He'd found his own redemption. And maybe, just maybe, he'd found a family. The sun rose over the ridge, soft and golden, bathing the land in warmth that hadn't touched it in years. The shack no longer leaning, no longer hollow, stood upright with new beams across its roof and a front porch that didn't creak when stepped on. A week had passed since Hanley was taken away in shackles. A week since the town of Dry Creek shifted its spine and stood tall for the first time in years. Luke McAllister stood on that porch now, coffee steaming in his tin cup, staring out toward the cottonwood tree. Beneath it rested two graves, freshly tended, with crosses Clara had sanded and painted herself. Inside, laughter floated from the tiny kitchen. Clara was humming something half-remembered from her mother's lullabies as she set the table. A loaf of cornbread was cooling on the windowsill, and beans simmered over the fire. The green ribbon she always wore fluttered as she moved, tied now around a proper braid. Luke stepped in just as she turned to him with two plates. "You gonna eat before it goes cold?" she asked with mock sternness. Luke smiled and sat down. "Didn't know I was hired as a ranch hand and fed like a king. You helped fix the roof." She grinned. "That earns you breakfast." They ate quietly, like a pair who had done this for years. The silence between them was never heavy. It was the kind that speaks of peace, shared grief, shared work, and the comfort of knowing someone will be there when the day starts. When breakfast was done, Clara stood up and grabbed her sketchbook. "I want to show you something," she said. Flipping to the back page, she turned it around. It was a drawing not of the house, not of the graves, but of the two of them. Luke in his coat and hat, standing beside her as she held a hammer. Behind them, a rebuilt cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. The sun was shining in the sketch, and across the bottom, in her best handwriting, she had written, "My new beginning." Luke blinked slowly. That drawing struck deeper than anything else ever had. "You're real good at that." Clara shrugged shyly. "Helps me remember, helps me believe." Luke stared at the picture for a long while, then finally said, "Clara, what do you want to do with this place, now that it's yours?" She looked out the window. "I want to plant something, maybe flowers, beans, too. And I want to keep drawing, maybe open a school here someday, a small one, for kids like me, who didn't have much but still dreamed." Luke leaned back. "That's a good dream." She hesitated, then asked, "Will you stay?" "You don't have to, but I'd like it if you did." Luke looked at her then, not as a stranger's daughter, not even as someone he saved, but as the closest thing to family he'd ever had. "I was fixin' to ride out soon," he said, slowly, but now he paused, watching her face. "Now I think I'd rather see what this place looks like with a garden, and maybe a school, and a girl who sketches the sky every night before bed." Clara lit up. "You mean it?" Dude." She ran forward and hugged him tight, arms wrapped around his middle like she was anchoring herself to the world. Luke stood frozen for a second, and then placed a gentle hand on the back of her head. He didn't have much, no family name, no ranch to pass down, but here, on a ridge in Dry Creek, with this girl who'd whispered for one coin, just to bury her father, he'd found something he never thought he would, belonging. Weeks passed, then months. They rebuilt the garden. Clara planted wildflowers beside the graves. Luke installed a water barrel. The preacher came by on Sundays, and townsfolk started calling her Miss Clara, no longer the orphan, no longer the beggar. One day, Mrs. Price came up the ridge with a bundle of books under her arm. "I heard someone was planning to open a school here," she said. Clara's eyes widened. "Really? You'll need these, and a sign," Mrs. Price said with a faint smile. "I can paint. You think of a name." Clara glanced at Luke. He nodded, encouraging, and that night, she carved it into the wooden sign herself. The Second Chance School. When she showed Luke, he just smiled and tipped his hat. "Couldn't have named it better myself." From a whispered request for one coin, to a home rebuilt, to a future not borrowed, but earned. Clara Weller and Luke McAllister had written a new story, one the whole town would never forget.